Hello there, David Taylor on Mr Pelargonium, back with another video for the Pelargonium and Geranium Society. Now, I know we are getting a little bit into winter. I'm actually filming this on the 17th of December. Special day for me. It's actually my birthday, but that's a whole different issue. Now, I thought I would actually, at this stage, as I've got a number of plants in different growth modes, actually explain how to take your pelargoniums through the winter. So let's get going. Hi, welcome back to the channel. Now, I see on social media, and I also get a lot of comments on the videos that I do about how exactly to take pelargoniums through the winter. A fair number of people do have glass houses. Some people sort of keep a few plants on their windowsills indoors. And a lot of people, though, do get lanky growth, particularly if you've got low light conditions, say for instance in your house or indoors, or you may have a slightly sort of a greenhouse that's in a very sheltered position, much like my last one, funnily enough. So, you know, there are different ways that you can take your pelargoniums through the winter. So in general terms, there's a high maintenance and a low maintenance way of doing it. So realistically, it depends how much time you want to donate to your plants during the winter months. Now, in the main, the majority of growers, therefore, will strip their plants back in the autumn, cut them back, strip some of the bulk of the leaves off, and just let them run more or less through the winter with very little maintenance. That's the sort of low maintenance method of doing it. You can keep your glass house, you know, ideally around about 4 or 5 degrees centigrade as the minimum. And that way round, they will need very little looking after. They'll need a little smidge of water in the bottom of a saucer, maybe once every 3 weeks or so, maybe even a little bit longer, depending on how far you strip them back. I'll show some examples of that. But yeah, that is the sort of low maintenance way. Now, the higher maintenance way, obviously, if you're someone such as myself that likes to exhibit plants in the summer, you will need to keep a little bit more flesh on them, but even so, they would have generally been cut back in the late summer or early autumn. De-leaved to a certain extent, again, I'll show examples in a moment. And, you know, with that way, you will need to water them probably once a fortnight or every 2 weeks. Occasionally once a week, just depends how much leaf you've got on them. They will grow a little bit, but then you basically, once the days start to lengthen at the end of January and into February, then you just slowly increase the watering and feeding again at that point. So I've got a really good cross section here of plants some of them have been through the wars, and I suppose I will start, if you like, with this one. Now this plant is actually a bicolour. It's a plant called Vettis ERS, and this was growing as a standard. And it actually, the top of the plant died back. I had it in the porch. I knew it needed a little bit more protection, but it got awful mould on the top. But I did potentially see, and I will close in a little bit more as well, I did actually see a number of little shoots growing out the base. So I just lopped the top off, and I actually saw that there was a number of little shoots just poking out the side. And you can clearly see these here just growing out the side of this stem. So I just lopped the top off, and I have not watered it at all. This is really now quite dry. But pelargoniums retain a lot, particularly the zonals. The zonals retain a lot. They're almost semi-succulent, you could say. They retain a lot of moisture in these sort of big stems, and so this will not require any water at all. So if you say add some leaves on this, strip them off and just literally lop the top of your plant off. You really do not want to do that though without ensuring that the plant is pretty much on the dry side. But providing that stem is firm and you want to give it a little squeeze perhaps before you do it, that should be able to maintain itself for really quite a long period. Now you can see here then all these little teeny breaks breaking out the sides, and I'm going to retain that. As I said, this was a long standard, so I was hopeful of getting it nice and tall. Clearly failed in this sort of instance, but I'm going to hopefully get quite a nice bush plant growing out of that. But the one thing that it doesn't need is any moisture. Particularly the bicolours and tricolours need less moisture anyway during the winter. So this now, I'm not doing anything with it at all. Once these begin to really shoot out and get to any specific size, I will probably just give a little minuscule amount of feedy water in the base of the saucer, and I'm talking a tiny amount, nothing more than a millimetre or two, just to give it a little bit around the base of its roots. But I won't start that until these shoots really begin to poke out. So there is almost an extreme example of a plant that needs very, very little maintenance during the winter. That could also survive quite well on a light windowsill. Preferably if you're keeping your plants indoors under a windowsill, you don't want them under a windowsill with a radiator. They don't need to be hot. All that will do will generate a lot of lanky growth, so you certainly don't want that. But this is obviously in a cool glass house, being well ventilated, and that is almost the extreme of zero maintenance during the winter. So let's just move that out of the way. Now, another example here of a plant that needs pretty little maintenance is a relatively young cutting. This was taken at the end of June, 30th of June cutting. I stripped back a number of the leaves. It's got a little growth break at the top, a few side shoots growing out here, one at the base. I'll turn around, that's the label in the way there. That one's growing out the side, so that's quite happy. Again, there's 5 leaves on it. That needs very little moisture. I'll probably give that a dribble of water, feedy water in the base of a saucer once every, certainly no more than 2 weeks. That will be quite happy, and that would probably be the majority of growers would have youngish cuttings like that taken through the winter. That's almost the next stage of maintenance. It's fairly pale at this time of year. It's a plant called bold cherub, which does have quite dark leaves, but this is characteristic of the fact that it's put on probably most of this growth in the sort of late autumn winter period. So you don't want it growing fast. You don't want anything more going on with that plant. Another example of a low maintenance plant is a plant that I basically did have a bit of dieback on, cut it back. This was about a month ago when I brought it into this glass house, stripped all its leaves off. And this is a bit of an older plant. These were cuttings taken right back at the beginning of the year in April. And this, you can see I've got lots of nice breaks coming on it. But what have I got? I've got 2 leaves, maybe 3. And that again is a plant, I think I've only watered that once. A little couple of millimetres in a saucer. When I first brought it in, I think when I first brought it into the glass house. That will only need watering once every 3 to 4 weeks. Again, until we start getting a bit of growth, these breaks here that you can see, they will break out, and as soon as we start to they get to an appreciable size, I will just give a little bit more water. But when I do water it, it will be an almost full strength feed, but it's getting very little of it. Right, next up is one with a few more leaves on it. Funnily enough, it's the same variety. It must be just the fact that I've had a fair number of these. So with this one, we got a little bit more growth. We've probably got 8 to 10 leaves. a little bit more on it, some growth stems, good growth stems. But the key thing is that the leaves are stripped back. I can remember taking the leaves off of this plant when I first brought it into the greenhouse about a month ago from a porch. Just enough to enable it to sort of continue to grow a bit, but you need air to get round these stems. That's the most vital thing that you need. This will only need watering once every 2 to 3 weeks. That is not going to barely grow much at all. Okay, so let's move up then to a show standard plant. Now, this is one that's come through fairly well. I mean, it did have a few dead and dying leaves on it, but I've stripped it back several weeks ago now. Again, we've got lots of air being able to reach the stems. This is a 6-inch pot. It's a Floribunda plant. It's Shrivenham Crown. It's one of my own that I bred a good number of years ago now. But it is a nice compact variety. Growing this in a 6-inch pot. So this is perhaps being earmarked for show. Now, the key thing with this is obviously a bit more to it. So it's going to transpire a bit more, even in the winter. You could argue that I potentially could get rid of a few more of these overlapping leaves, because you don't really want overlapping leaves in the winter. There is plenty of sort of air getting around this plant, and the key thing, of course, to note is that we got lots of young shoots all coming down around the base, and that's the key thing. Lots of light can get in there again, which is contributing to this deeper growth being nice and deep green, and this is what this stripping back of the leaves achieves. Now, because it's obviously, there's a marginally yellowing leaf, so I've opened this out, a little bit more. But this is sort of almost now the show standard. It's been cropped back. I did do a little bit of cutting back, I think, on the late winter on this plant. But all the leaf stripping I did, a few weeks back, which in a way was a bit late, but I've sort of got away with it with this one. So that's in sort of ideally where I will want it to be at this stage, in sort of latter part of December. But it will need a little bit more maintenance. This will probably need watering once a week to 2 weeks. I'm just checking to see how light that is. Yeah, that is fairly dry now, but again, when I do water it, it will only be 1 millimetre or 2 in the bottom of a saucer. So there's not going to be a lot of watering of this plant, even when I do water it. But it will need it a little bit more often. But that's almost the sort of the higher level of maintenance that's required on a plant that is being earmarked for something that you want, something a little bit special, like exhibiting and or sort of, timing to grow a plant for it to be a little bit more fleshy during the summer months. Now, a slightly different example are the Regals. Regals and Scentids will put on a little bit of growth during the winter. It is an example of a Regal, of a youngish Regal. This was only taken back in March, this cutting. So Regals, if you've got them in a glass house, they will put on a bit of growth over the winter. They like to grow during the cooler months. And even this little young plant here will require watering probably about once a week. Not a great deal, and that's the main thing that you need to remember. Even when you do water pelargoniums during the winter, they will not want a lot in one hit. This is why with this other plant, with the big zonal here that I just did show you, it's minimal but perhaps more often, rather than a big flush or a larger flush of water that you would give in the sort of main growing period of the summer. Obviously, if you've got an older plant, such as what I'm about to show you now, you would have cut it back quite hard. So let's have a look at that. Right, so what are the extremes then? Here's one extreme. This is a giant Regal. Now, I knew that I wasn't going to be able to maintain some of my plants, but this was one that I really did want to take through. It's a giant deli. Deli always grows very well for me. I've got some really large standards of it. I've got one over the back there. I think I've got another one somewhere as well. This is a really fantastic, big, strong growing Regal, and I crop this completely. And now this, I'm barely watering, and the reason for that is because there's very little flesh on it. So, I mean, it does come back to this scenario where if there's little flesh on the plant, it obviously needs little in the way of watering. And this giant plant here, I gave a little dribble, it's in a clay pot, a little dribble about a week or so ago. But there are loads and loads of shoots breaking out. Again, until those shoots really begin to break through and it really starts to get going in the sort of late winter, when the light levels begin to really change, it's not going to need much in the way of watering. Now, if you want another extreme, you go big with a scented leaf. And this is Charity, one of my favourite scented leaf varieties. Now, the only very minor issue I know I've got with this is that I've got a caterpillar on it somewhere. I've got a few leaves that are being chewed. So I need to scrutinise this plant and try and dig him out. I've reached a stage probably with a number of these now, because I've got a number of really big fleshy Regals as well, where I'm probably going to say I've got plenty of room. I don't need to worry too much about cutting this back. So I will just let this grow away. It's very, very happy. The leaves are a little bit darker. You can see these new leaves here that have obviously grown in the winter. Say the late autumn and the early part of winter. And they are a bit darker than the standard leaf. Again, there's a good example of a nice chewed one. These were the normal sort of dark green, very light lime green, normal colouring. But in the winter, the green sections are darker. So it's a very dark mid-tone green, and even the light green is much darker as well. But it's still a good contrast effect. But I'm going to leave that now. But because I'm virtually employed full-time in looking after my Pelargoniums, I give this a water actually a couple of days ago, and this does need watering. Certainly we get very sunny, dry periods. This will need watering once a week, maybe once a fortnight, and I will need to give it a little bit more. So there we are. I think I've given you a good background on the methods that you can use to get your plants through the winter. Basically, the less leaf there is on it, the less they're going to need watering and the less maintenance they're going to need to get through the winter period. So there we go. It gives you a little bit of background of the methods to use for basically how much maintenance you want to give them during the winter. So I'm going to wrap this one up. That's it from me today. I hope to see you again very, very soon. Goodbye from me for now.